Assalamu alaikum. In this video, I'm going to address a claim that you might hear every now and then from Jews, that all these problematic descriptions of God that we find in Tanakh and Talmud, etc., that these are all just metaphors, that God He doesn't even actually get angry, He doesn't love. All these things are just metaphorical descriptions, and the way they describe it is God is just using human language for us to understand. And also, this bleeds into the one of my major critiques of the Talmud, even extends towards the Tanakh, where we have a weak God, we have a God who's brought down in many ways to the level of a human. So they say, no, this is all just symbolic, etc., etc. So I'm going to tackle that claim today. And the way I'm going to do this is we're first going to look at these Talmudic passages, and we'll see obviously the Talmudic era rabbis, those who were writing the Talmud and the Midrashim, they obviously thought that these were literal descriptions. It's so obvious when you read this rabbinic literature what they thought. Okay, so that's evidence number one, that it's just too obvious. Like when you read it, you know what's up. And the second way through which we can know that is by looking at early critiques of Judaism. And so we have actually secondary sources which back up people who were writing critiques of Judaism were mentioning that this is what the Jews and the rabbis believe. So we actually know from early church fathers and other sources that ancient rabbis actually believed these things as we find them literally stated in the Talmud. So those are the two things we'll go over today. And then it was later rabbis who, out of embarrassment and philosophical inclination, sort of reinterpreted these passages. So let's begin by looking at the Talmud, and it's so obvious what's going on here. So number one, let's look at this narration from Rabbi said to this rabbi, from where is it derived that the Holy One, blessed be He, wears phylacteries? So what are phylacteries? These are, it's actually a religious, it's actually a religious thing that Jews wear. It's like this black cube which has some verses from Torah which praise God in them, and they keep it so they remember as a sign that they should keep the Torah, etc., etc. So now they say, well, from how do we know that God Himself wears these phylacteries? And then they say, as it is stated, the Lord has sworn by His right hand and by the arm of His strength. Okay, so then they explain, since it is customary to swear upon holy objects, it is understood that His right hand and the arm of His strength are the holy objects upon which God swore. Okay, so then they mention, okay, which verses are written in these phylacteries. What is written in the phylacteries of the Master of the world? This Rav replies, it is written, who is like your people, Israel, one nation in the land. God's phylacteries serve to connect Him in a sense to the world, the essence of which is Israel. Then they ask, essentially, what else is written? Here, Israel, so you have made me a single entity in the world, as it is stated that Israel declares God's oneness by saying, hear Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one, Deuteronomy 6, and because of this I will make you into a single entity in the world, unique and elevated with the utterance, who is like your people, Israel, one nation in the land. Consequentially, the Holy One, blessed be He, is glorified through the glory of Israel, whose praises are written in God's phylacteries. Then they mention, okay, so that's what's written in one of the compartments, because in these phylacteries there are 4 different compartments. Well, what about the other compartments? What is written in the rest of the compartments of God's phylacteries of the head, as you can see here? Then they mention all these other verses. Then they say, well, there are too many verses. There are only 4 compartments. So they say, well, some of them are jumbled together, right? So if all of these verses are included in God's phylacteries of the head, there are too many compartments, as more than 4 were listed. Rather, the portions in God's phylacteries must be arranged as follows, and then they jumble some together, etc., etc. So when you read this, this is obviously not a symbolic meaning. It's pretty clear what's going on. I'll give you another example. Here's from the Midrash. And this is actually very relevant, knowing that they saw Adam as being literally created in the image of God. And I've done a video on this where I've shown a couple more examples through which we can know this. But this is actually pretty useful, because what it does is it shows us that these descriptions that we find of God, these descriptions that are blasphemous, they actually literally believed them because they literally thought that Adam was created and Adam resembled God, right? So because they literally thought that, that actually really supports the idea that these were not metaphorical descriptions, but actual literal descriptions. And some of these stories, you'll notice that they don't make any sense if they're metaphorical. So let's read this midrash. Well, the Holy One of Blessing created the first Adam. The ministering angels erred and wanted to say the Kedoshah before him. Kedoshah is a prayer that is written to glorify God in Judaism. A parable, a king and his governor were in a chariot, and the people of the realm wanted to say domain to the king, but didn't know which one was the king. So the angels erred. They wanted to praise Adam as if he was God. Because they thought he was God, they wanted to say Kedoshah. So the parable is given that a king and his governor were both in a chariot. Basically the people were confused as to which was the king. So what did the king do? He shoved the governor and ejected him from the chariot, and everyone knew that one was the governor. So too, when the Holy One of Blessing created the first Adam, the ministering angels erred and wanted to say the Kedoshah before him. What did the Holy One of Blessing do? He caused slumber to fall upon him, so everyone knew that one was the Adam, as it is written, withdraw from the Adam who has breath in his nostrils, for how little is he to be esteemed. It's so obvious what's going on here. And over again, we find these literal, obvious descriptions. And then it's later rabbis who try and save this out of embarrassment. So, study. Okay, so let's go to another one. This is so obvious. This is so obvious in the Talmud. This is. There are 12 hours in the day. During the first 3, the Holy One, blessed be He, sits and engages in Torah study. Then during the second 3 hours, he sits and judges the entire world. And then what does he do? He sits on his throne of mercy. And then what does he do? He sustains the world. Then what does he do? He sits and makes sport with the Leviathan. As it is written, there is Leviathan whom you have formed to sport with. Sport means to play. So he's playing with the Leviathan. Okay? So I'll show you this here. And the commentary mentions this as well. So a tradition in which God laughs, playing with the Leviathan every day. So he plays. Obviously, this is literal. Like, there's no other way to read this. And even I'll address at the end the idea that, even if it's metaphorical, is it okay? I'll discuss that at the end, if I remember, inshallah. But then we see they mention God, doesn't play anymore, and then they mention what does he do at night. So let's go here. One of the things they say you wish you can say that God does at night is he rides on his light cherub and flies in 18,000 worlds. As it is stated, the chariots of God are 20,000, even thousands, some. So they're even quoting scripture to prove their positions. And if you wish, say instead that God sits and listens to the songs from the mouth of the angelic creatures. As it is stated, by day the Lord will command his loving kindness, and in the night his song shall be with me. Psalm 42:9. Like, it's so obvious how the Talmudic rabbis were looking at this. But now let's go to some secondary evidence. So this is from the article. I'll show you the title of the article in a second. Anthropomorphism in Talmudic Literature. And here they mention. Okay, so I'm in the wrong place, but I'll just show you. This is the name of the article: Anthropomorphism in Talmudic Literature, Trends in Jewish Thought and Scholarly Research. And if we go here, okay, so mentioned rabbinic literature should be read in its historical context with a greater emphasis on its literal meaning. Its investigations should be conducted with accordance with the categories of the research of methodology. So they're putting forward, this is one of the things that many scholars mentioned should be done. This trend, once at the periphery of scholarship, has gained increasing acceptance among scholars in recent years based upon the immense diversity of anthropomorphisms in Midrash and primarily in reliance upon supplementary sources. There is a growing tendency among scholars toward the belief that the concept of God in human form is a constitutive element in the worldview of the Talmudic rabbis, or at least in certain central groups among them. So if we go to this footnote at 117, they mention these sources, so these secondary sources that testify that Talmudic rabbis saw God like this. They include Inter Alia, the writings of the Church Fathers. primarily from the 2nd to the 4th century. So you have church fathers who are criticizing Judaism for having this human version of God. And by the way, I'll just say this. There are some things that are mentioned here, like God having fingers, hands, etc. Now, we have similar concepts in Islam, but if the Talmudic rabbis were actually literally thinking about God as Adam as resembling God, then when they speak about God's fingers and hands, etc., so they would imagine human fingers, human hands. That's not what we believe in Islam. Yes, we believe God has something like a hand. That's mentioned in the Bible as well, that God has a hand, etc. God has a face. But what we say about that is we have a face, we have hands, and God also has a face, God also has hands and stuff. But his hand, for example, is not like our hand. The way we think of a hand, it's not like that hand. It's unique to him. It's completely different, and it's not like our hand. Okay, so yes, we have a hand and God has a hand, but his hand is different to us. And the main point I'm trying to show you here is that if the Talmudic rabbis did believe in these things literally, which they obviously did, it's so obvious, then this is supported by the fact that you have outside testimony from other groups testifying to this. So the writings of the church fathers, they attest to the Jewish conception of God as possessing human form. The early Jewish mystical writings, all collected in what is known as the Hekalot and Merkabah literature, the New Testament, Jewish Christian sources, Gnostic sources, and even parts of the Kabbalah. Starting from the end of the 12th century, some researchers have suggested that conclusions may be drawn from this literature regarding Talmudic literature. From this literature regarding Talmudic literature. Anyway, point is, they're mentioning church fathers and many other sources which testify that they actually literally believe this. Here's another article on this. And here they mention Zoroastrian critiques. So this is from the 9th century. And they mention that the Zoroastrians, they had a problem with the corporeality of God in the Jewish tradition. You can read this all out if you want. So they were, what is corporeality? So they mentioned things like God corporeality. That means being like a human, essentially. The quality being physical, consisting of matter, corporeality, physicalness, materialness, etc. So they mentioned things like God growing tired, etc., etc. Now, in fact, this whole idea of this philosophical God that many Jews will put forth today, and this idea that everything is metaphorical, these sorts of ideas that God doesn't actually have these attributes, you won't find anything like that in the Bible nor in Talmudic era literature. Of course, if you ask Jews today, and some of these things I mentioned, like God getting angry and Jews taking that literally, that's pretty obvious if we read the Bible. But today, Jews will say, all that is metaphorical. It's just using language to describe God so humans can understand. But any reading of the Bible in the Talmudic era literature does not support that. It doesn't. Clearly, the Talmudic era rabbis believed God was above. It's even mentioned in the Bible, God is above. And that when they speak about these things regarding God, and my interest, of course, is whenever they start attributing weaknesses to God, I'm not necessarily, or I am not definitively critiquing this from the point of view of these Zoroastrians here who would say, oh, why don't you have this philosophical conception of God? No, we don't agree with that in Islam. What I'm critiquing is these ideas of, oh, it's all metaphorical. I'm responding to that. I'm saying, no, it's not metaphorical. These Talmudic era rabbis did not see it as metaphorical. They thought about it literally. Then later, when philosophy, and a lot of this actually came about because Jews were they were living in an Islamic empire. Before that, they had many critiques which contributed to. Then they were living in an Islamic empire, and unfortunately, the Islamic empire was very influenced by philosophy. It was very, very influenced by philosophy, and that led to a lot of deviant sects that came about in Islam who used philosophy to reject the clear meaning of the Quran, etc., etc., and that sort of thinking affected the Jews as well. And again, this is also what scholars point out, so I've shown already a couple references, but here's another reference. This is a scholar who looks at the Bible, he looks at Talmudic sources. So here, for example, he shows a Talmudic narration which clearly describes God as having a little finger through which he consumes the angels with fire. It's a pretty literal narration if you read it. And then he looks at what many of the early sages, how they interpreted these passages, as well as sort of they interpreted these biblical sources and what was in the Talmud. And he mentions Christians and Zoroastrians, etc., who criticized Jews for this. And then at the end, this is his conclusion. Ancient Jewish belief attributed to God a figure and all its parts, such as hands, fingers, etc. This gigantic figure had no measure in biblical times, but was an issue of speculation in the Talmudic period. When sages began to identify its precise size, the only difference between Shir Choma and Talmudic sources is that Shir Choma shows a highly systematic and more intensive calculation of God's sizes. This difference does not necessarily reflect any assumed gap in between those sources in the post-Talmudic period. Jews were under theological and philosophical pressure that made them reject anthropomorphic beliefs by reshaping old texts or even by not copying them. By the way, anthropomorphic just means the attribution of human characteristics or behavior to a god, animal, or object, something that many rabbis today, etc., would say, no, that's all just language the Bible is using and the Talmud is using to make humans understand. No. Clearly, those rabbis believed in these anthropomorphic beliefs, but later on these were rejected by reshaping old texts or even by not copying them. Needless to say that this polemic led to the blurring of the anthropomorphic God in Talmudic texts. However, the ancient belief did survive, mostly not under Muslim rule, in Provence, France, and southern Germany. In those places, many sages, and probably laymen as well, thought that there was nothing wrong in believing in an anthropomorphic God as their forefathers did. And of course, all this applies to our criticisms when we talk about how, they speak about God having phylacteries, wearing phylacteries, studying Torah, playing, etc. So the fact that they were looking at all these texts literally, of course, it also shows that they were looking at the text that we show to show they had that the Talmudic God is a very weak God and a deficient God as well. That they actually literally believed those things as they're clearly written out in the Talmud, and in fact, anyone who just reads it can tell that's what they meant as well. So nowadays, many Jews will say God is nowhere. He's not even above his heavens. Whenever the Bible describes God, it's metaphorical. Maimonides was like this. He came from a philosophical background and he became very popular. He's very popular amongst the Jews. But Maimonides, whenever he would see something in Tanakh or Talmudic literature which he didn't like, it didn't go in line with his Greek philosophy, he would say it's metaphorical. So we see this, for example, he says any description of God which is somehow like God gets angry and all this is all just language, and it must be understood metaphorically. So he makes these things up because they don't align with his philosophical beliefs. And so my critique of Judaism, I'm looking at the Talmudic rabbis, I'm looking at what the books actually say, what these rabbis actually believed, and I'm critiquing it. Now, Jews today are philosophically inclined and influenced by Greek philosophy and all these things, and also they're embarrassed. Frankly, they're embarrassed by a lot of the stuff that we find here. The Talmudic era descriptions of God, for example, God wearing phylacteries, they find that embarrassing. Some of them do. In fact, most of them do, if not all of them. And so, out of embarrassment, they try and cover it up. Just like, for example, the Bible says God rests and refreshes. The word for refresh is used elsewhere as well, and actually means to take a breath, and it means that, you recover from tiredness. That's how it's used elsewhere as well. But Jews and Christians are embarrassed, and they're embarrassed by it, so they have to try and reinterpret it. So it's embarrassment and it's philosophical influence that causes Jews to sort of reinterpret these clear passages. But, whenever they find something in their books that it's hard to deal with, reinterpret. Oh, it doesn't mean that. Oh, it doesn't. No, it does. And if we start reinterpreting everything we find in our literature because it doesn't align with our beliefs, then what's the point, right? What's the point of anything? And so it's actually very ironic because Jews will criticize Christians for reinterpreting the Bible. They'll say, no, you have to read it in its context. You have to do exegesis, not eisegesis. Exegesis means you read the text and take out what the text is actually saying. Eisegesis means when you're reading into the text. But ironically, Jews will do eisegesis. They will read into the text whatever they want whenever they're looking at their books and they find something problematic. Now, even if, hypothetically, even if we are to say that these are in fact metaphors, that doesn't actually solve the problem, because that's not an excuse, right? So imagine someone insults God for 5 hours, because that's essentially what these are, hours and hours of writings insulting God, ascribing deficiencies to God, etc. So imagine someone insults God for 5 hours, and then at the end he just goes, "Don't worry, it's all a metaphor." No, that's not an excuse. Okay, you still deserve to be cursed by God and go to hell. Right? So imagine someone were to insult your mother for 5 hours, right? With the worst of insults. And then at the end, after 20 minutes of insulting your mother, he just goes, "Don't worry, buddy, it's all a metaphor." No, that guy, that doesn't solve it, okay? We've still got a problem.